Imagine entering a seemingly ordinary forest and disappearing for 9 years without a trace, only to return with a story that defies all logic. This is exactly what happened to Felipe Duarte, a nature photographer who, in 2014, embarked on an expedition to document an isolated forest deep in the Amazon. What was supposed to be a journey of inspiration and beauty turned into one of the most disturbing mysteries of his life. Felipe was known for his keen eye and bravery in exploring remote areas. His passion for capturing the essence of nature took him to places few dared to go. However, when he entered the misty forest, a little mapped area filled with local legends, not even his vast experience could prepare him for what was to come. The first few days of his expedition were documented with stunning photographs and meticulous notes. After that, silence. There were no more updates, no messages to family or colleagues. Search teams scoured the region for months, but no trace of him was found. It was as if the forest had swallowed Felipe whole. For 9 years, his family resigned themselves to the idea that he had either gotten lost or had fallen victim to the wilderness. But in 2023, Felipe suddenly reappeared in the same area where he had disappeared. He looked visibly thinner but didn't seem to have aged a day. The story he told upon his return is so unbelievable that no one knows if it's a product of imagination or a glimpse into something much greater. What did Felipe see in that forest? How did he survive all that time? And, most strangely, why does he believe he was there for only a few months? Stay until the end to uncover the hidden secrets of the misty forest. Felipe Duarte's story begins in Sao Paulo, where he grew up surrounded by the concrete of the big city, yet with an unwavering passion for nature. From a young age, Felipe showed a sharp eye for the details of the natural world, which led him to become a wildlife photographer. By the age of 34, he had built a solid career, with his photographs published in international magazines and acclaimed exhibitions. In 2014, Felipe received an opportunity that felt like a dream. An environmental organization hired him to document the biodiversity of a remote area of the Amazon rainforest known as the Misty Forest. The region acquired this name due to its frequent dense fog, creating a mysterious atmosphere. The forest remained almost unexplored because of its isolated location and the numerous frightening stories told by locals. Residents believed the misty forest was cursed. Tales of people disappearing without a trace were common. Some said the fog concealed portals to other worlds, while others spoke of an invisible presence guarding the heart of the forest. Mas Felipe, always skeptical, viewed these stories as myths and folklore. For him, the forest was merely another stunning backdrop waiting to be captured. Felipe set off on his expedition in June 2014, well prepared with top-notch photography equipment, enough supplies for weeks, and a journal to document every moment. His plan was to enter the forest, map the area with photos and return in 3 weeks. Accompanied by 2 local guides, he began his journey with enthusiasm. The first few days were everything he had hoped for. He captured images of breathtaking landscapes, from towering trees draped in moss to tiny, shimmering insects that looked like they had come straight out of a fairy tale. However, the deeper they ventured into the forest, the more Felipe noticed a change. The mist grew thicker and more persistent, obscuring visibility and creating a surreal atmosphere. The guides, who had been confident until then, began to show signs of nervousness. On the 5th day, they arrived at a clearing where the ambient sounds seemed to vanish. With no birds singing or insects buzzing, the silence was almost deafening. The guides refused to go any further, insisting that this was the forbidden line. They pleaded with Felipe to turn back with them, but he insisted on continuing. For him, that clearing was a fascinating mystery, a place that needed exploration. The next day, Felipe left his guides behind and ventured alone into the heart of the misty forest. He promised to return in a few days, but he was never seen again. What seemed like a bold professional choice quickly turned into a terrifying mystery. The forest had swallowed Felipe, just as it had with so many others before him. Thus began the disappearance that would make him part of the legends of the misty forest, until his unexpected return 9 years later. At the moment Felipe crossed the clearing and said goodbye to his guides, he felt a mix of excitement and unease. He knew he was entering unexplored territory, but that was exactly the kind of challenge that fascinated him. With his camera hanging around his neck and a rudimentary map in hand, he plunged deeper into the misty forest, leaving behind the last vestige of human companionship. As he advanced, the fog thickened even more, to the point where he could barely see a few meters ahead. The sunlight, which had once filtered through the tree canopies, had almost entirely vanished, replaced by a diffuse and cold illumination, as if he were under a perpetually overcast sky. The air was humid and dense, making it hard to breathe, and the absolute silence began to weigh heavily on his mind. Felipe continued walking for hours, taking photos and jotting down details in his journal. He encountered trees that appeared twisted in unnatural ways, their trunks spiraling in defiance of gravity. Small points of light seemed to float around some of the trees, but they vanished whenever he tried to approach them. He thought it might be some kind of bioluminescent insect, but the lights emitted no sound and didn't move like a living creature. It was while trying to photograph one of these phenomena that he realized something was wrong with his equipment. The camera, which had been working perfectly until that moment, stopped responding. He tried replacing the batteries, but even the spare parts seemed to be dead. When he checked the GPS, the screen displayed only a blur of coordinates that changed randomly. It must be the humidity, he thought, trying to stay calm. But deep down he knew something else was happening. He noticed that even his watch had stopped working, frozen at 11:37, the time he had entered the clearing. As he tried to process what was going on, he heard a distant sound, a low, almost imperceptible hum, but constant. He followed the sound, thinking it might be a stream or some natural phenomenon, but as he moved closer, the noise intensified, becoming deeper and more resonant. Suddenly he arrived at another open space, an even larger clearing but completely different from the first. In the center stood a colossal tree, bigger than anything he had ever seen. Its branches spread out like tentacles, and the trunk was covered with markings that resembled ancient symbols, engraved directly into the wood. Surrounding the tree were small objects scattered on the ground, relics that seemed to belong to different eras. There was an old compass, a metal canteen, a pocket watch, and even what appeared to be a vintage camera. As Felipe approached the tree, the humming stopped abruptly, plunging the area into absolute silence. He felt a pressure in his ears, as if the air around him had grown heavier. Something deep in his mind urged him to leave, but he couldn't resist. He touched the surface of the tree, and at that moment, a wave of heat coursed through his body. His vision blurred and he fell to his knees, struggling to catch his breath. When he opened his eyes again, the world around him had completely transformed. The forest seemed more alive, more vivid, but also more threatening. He knew something had happened, but he had no idea he had just crossed into a realm where time and reality did not follow the rules he understood. As Felipe got to his feet, he realized that something was fundamentally wrong. The misty forest was no longer the same. The fog that once enveloped the area now seemed to have its own light, a faint glow that pulsed gently, almost like a breath. The absolute silence had been replaced by sounds he couldn't identify, distant whispers, rhythmic crackles, and a constant buzzing that seemed to come from all sides. He looked around and noticed that the objects at the base of the colossal tree had vanished, as if they had never existed. The markings on the tree trunk now glowed with a golden light, and he felt a shiver as he realized the symbols appeared to move slowly as if they were alive. He tried to jot this down in his journal, but the pages were blank, even though he was certain he had written on them before. Felipe knew he needed to get away from that place. Crossing the clearing and heading back into the dense forest, he realized his perception of the environment was distorted. Trees he could have sworn he had passed before now looked different, larger, and more menacing. The path back seemed to have vanished, as if the forest was rearranging itself, blocking his escape. As he explored, Felipe stumbled upon what appeared to be a trail, but something about it felt off. The ground was covered in dry leaves that made no sound beneath his steps. Further along, he came across a structure that made him stop immediately. A cabin, weathered by time, almost completely overtaken by vegetation. He entered cautiously, clutching a stone as his only means of defense. The interior of the cabin was empty, except for a table and a broken chair. On the table lay a very old notebook, its pages yellowed and torn. He opened it to find drawings that looked like maps of the forest, but none made sense. On one page, something made him tremble. A detailed sketch of the colossal tree he had touched, with the same glowing symbols etched into the trunk. Felipe noticed that, in one corner of the cabin, there seemed to be a makeshift altar, with extinguished candles and ancient objects, like a stone amulet and carefully arranged bones. He didn't know who had made that, but he felt that the place had been abandoned in a hurry. As he stepped out of the cabin, something caught his attention. A quick shadow darted between the trees, disappearing before he could identify it. His heart raced. Could it be an animal? Or was there someone else in that forest? Felipe followed the sound, driven more by curiosity than by reason. Further along, he encountered something even more disturbing. A field of lost belongings, like a graveyard of human possessions. There were suitcases, torn clothes, broken watches, and even old cameras. Everything seemed to have been left there long ago, but there was no sign of bodies or any explanation about who had left them behind. He knew he was getting closer to something, but with each step, he felt the forest pulling him deeper in as if it had a life of its own. Felipe didn't know if he would find answers or just more questions. All he knew was that from that point on, nothing would ever be the same again. The days passed, or at least that's what Felipe believed. His sense of time had become completely confused. The sun never seemed to move, keeping the forest in a perpetual twilight, as if the day would never end. He began to realize that survival would be an even greater challenge than he had imagined. Hunger soon became a problem. Felipe searched for fruits or edible plants, but everything seemed strange and unfamiliar. He found brightly colored fruits with unusual shapes, but hesitated to eat them, fearing they might be poisonous. Finally, necessity overcame his hesitation, and he tried a blue fruit with a gelatinous texture. It tasted sweet, but soon he felt a strange sensation, as if the environment around him was shifting. The trees seemed to lean closer, and the whispers in the forest grew louder, almost like voices. He decided never to touch that fruit again. With no options left, he began to improvise tools to fish in the small streams he found in the forest. However, when he looked at the water, he noticed there were no signs of fish or any other aquatic life. The stream, despite being crystal clear, seemed lifeless. He started gathering large leaves to collect rainwater but noticed that the drops falling had a greenish tint. As he explored, Felipe began to notice strange patterns in the sounds around him. They seemed to follow him as if something, or someone, was mimicking his movements. He heard footsteps echoing his own, but he never saw anyone. The forest seemed to toy with his mind, and he began to question his own sanity. On one of the darkest nights, Felipe built a makeshift shelter in a space between the trees, using branches and leaves. The feeling of being watched never left him, and he started having recurring nightmares. In one of them, he saw the colossal tree again, but this time it seemed to wrap around him with its branches while the glowing symbols shone brightly and whispered words he couldn't understand. One morning, Felipe was awakened by a sound that was unlike anything he had ever heard. A soft music, almost like a song coming from deep within the forest. Against his instincts, he followed the sound, drawn in as if he were hypnotized. The trail led him to a hidden lake, whose water had a silvery glow. In the center of the lake was a small island, and on it stood a structure that looked like a tall stone, carved with the same symbols he had seen on the tree. As he approached the lake, he noticed that the voices in the air had become clearer, though still incomprehensible. He felt an inexplicable urge to enter the water and reach the structure, but something stopped him, a reflection in the lake. He saw what appeared to be a figure standing behind him, but when he turned around there was no one there. Felipe was on the brink of a mental collapse, yet he knew he had to keep searching for answers. He felt that everything was connected: the tree, the symbols, the voices, and the forest itself. He just didn't know if finding these answers meant his salvation, or something much worse. The presence Felipe felt with each step now seemed more intense. It was as if the forest was alive, watching him, testing him. He knew that continuing to explore was dangerous, but something inexplicable urged him on. A feeling that he was close to something important, something that could explain what was happening. Driven by a mix of curiosity and desperation, Felipe decided to return to the Silver Lake. This time he was determined to cross the water and reach the structure on the small island. Using branches and vines, he improvised a rudimentary raft and pushed it out onto the lake. As he began to paddle, he noticed that the water seemed to resist his movements, as if it had a will of its own. Each stroke was a struggle, and the sound of the voices around him grew louder, echoing among the trees. As he approached the island, Felipe saw that the stone structure was not just a monolith. It was covered in symbols that pulsed with a golden light, almost like a heartbeat. When he finally reached the shore, he felt a wave of heat wash over him. It was as if the island itself were alive. He touched the stone cautiously, and the moment his fingers made contact with its surface, time around him seemed to stop. The voices fell silent, the forest became completely still, and an intense feeling of gravity pulled him to the ground. Felipe felt as if he were being sucked into something invisible, a force that held him captive to the stone. Suddenly, his vision darkened and he was flooded with images, not his own memories but visions of others. He saw people from different eras, dressed in clothing from centuries past, all walking through the same forest. Some looked frightened, others appeared resigned, but they all shared something in common: they were lost. The visions intensified. He saw ancient buildings being consumed by the vegetation, people vanishing into thin air, and the colossal tree he had encountered, glowing like a beacon in a world of shadows. He sensed that this tree was the center of it all, a convergence point between worlds or dimensions. When the vision ceased, Felipe found himself back in the lake. He was lying on the raft, floating back to the shore. The structure on the island had vanished completely, as if it had never existed. He didn't know how much time had passed, but he felt that something inside him had changed. As he returned to the forest, Felipe noticed that the mist was beginning to dissipate. He instinctively followed what appeared to be an exit, and for the first time he found a clear path. However, as he walked, he noticed something disturbing: handprints on the ground, as if dozens of people had crawled along the same route, trying to escape. When Felipe finally saw the sunlight again, he knew he had left the misty forest behind. But he also understood that part of him had been left behind, and that the forest would never forget him. As Felipe emerged from the misty forest, the world around him seemed different. The brightness of the sun was blinding, and the heat on his skin felt strange, as if he hadn't experienced natural light in years. He could barely recognize the path he had taken to enter, and the trees now appeared ordinary, devoid of the oppressive atmosphere they once held. But something was wrong. Felipe felt that he had crossed an invisible boundary and instinctively knew he was no longer in the same place he had left. As he made his way back to the nearest village, Felipe encountered something that left him paralyzed. A group of people stood in the middle of the trail, staring at him with expressions of astonishment. They whispered among themselves, pointing at him. Felipe tried to speak, but his voice was hoarse, as if he hadn't used his vocal cords in a long time. An older man, who seemed to be a local leader, approached hesitantly and asked, "Are you Felipe Duarte?" Felipe was confused. "Yes, it's me. What's happening? Why are you all looking at me like that?" The man shook his head in disbelief and replied, "You disappeared 9 years ago." These words hit Felipe like a blow. To him, only weeks or maybe a month had passed, but he never imagined that so much time had gone by. He tried to process the information, but the idea seemed impossible. His mind insisted it was a mistake until the villagers took him to the village and showed him old photos of missing person posters with his face on them. Upon arriving in the village, Felipe found a scene that felt like a nightmare. People were crying and murmuring about his return as if he were a ghost. He was taken to a house where a woman waited for him, tears in her eyes, his older sister, whom he could hardly recognize due to her aging. "Felipe, is it really you?" she said, her voice trembling. "Yes, it's me," he replied, unsure of what else to say. She hugged him, but there was a mix of joy and fear in her gaze. He realized that while everyone around him had changed over the years, he appeared exactly the same. There wasn't a single additional wrinkle on his face, nor any signs of physical wear. In the days that followed, Felipe tried to explain what had happened, but his story seemed so unbelievable that many began to question his sanity. He recounted the colossal tree, the pulsing mist, and the visions he experienced, but most people attributed it to extreme isolation or some form of psychological trauma. The doctors who examined him were puzzled. His physical tests showed that Felipe was in perfect health, with no signs of aging or deficiency, as if he had been frozen in time. Researchers began to speculate about temporal anomalies or even dimensional portals in the misty forest, but no one could provide concrete answers. Although he was back in the real world, Felipe didn't feel safe. He knew there was something deeper in the forest, something that didn't belong to our world. At night, he dreamed of the tree and heard the same whispers, as if the forest was still calling him. Felipe had escaped, but deep down he knew it wasn't the end. The misty forest had let him go, but not without taking something from him, and not without leaving a part of itself behind. Felipe Duarte's return quickly became one of the greatest mysteries of his time. Newspapers and television channels covered his story, dubbing him the man who conquered time. But while the world debated theories about what had happened, Felipe knew that the truth was something no one could truly comprehend. He tried to move on, but the events in the misty forest continued to haunt him. Every night, he heard the same whispers in his dreams, voices that seemed to call him back. Sometimes he envisioned the colossal tree in his mind, the symbols glowing as if they were a message he still couldn't decipher. It was as if a part of his soul remained trapped in that place, waiting to be freed. Researchers began to study the area of the forest where he had disappeared, but the region seemed to have changed completely. The clearing where the tree stood was now just a patch of ordinary land, with nothing out of place. No structures, symbols, or signs of temporal anomalies were found. The misty forest seemed to have erased any evidence of its supernatural existence. Felipe decided to keep a low profile. He stopped giving interviews and avoided talking about what had happened. Not because he wanted to hide anything, but because he knew that no one could fully understand what he had experienced. However, he kept a secret diary, where he noted every fragment of memory that still surfaced, hoping to one day find a connection that would explain everything. Despite his attempts to start over, Felipe felt that his story was not yet over. He had a constant sensation of being watched, even in safe and familiar places. In moments of silence, he heard footsteps echoing where there was no one. Then, on a particularly quiet night, something happened that made him freeze in fear. While reviewing his notes in his room, Felipe heard a low, familiar sound, the same hum he had heard in the forest. He looked around, trying to find the source, but there was nothing. It was then that he noticed something disturbing. His watch, which had stopped since the day he touched the tree, began to move again. The hand spun backward as if time were reversing. Felipe tried to rip the watch off his wrist, but before he could react, the lights in the house flickered, and he felt a wave of heat wash over his body. He screamed, but everything around him went dark. The next morning, his sister found the room empty. Felipe had disappeared again, leaving no trace except for his diary, where the last entry read, "I think I never really left the nebulous forest." Felipe Duarte's disappearance remains unsolved. What did he find in the nebulous forest? Was he called back? And if he was, will he be able to return again? And you, do you believe that places like the nebulous forest really exist? Are there hidden portals in the world, waiting for those brave or foolish enough to cross them? Share your thoughts in the comments and leave your mark on this endless mystery.